The Tops, Programme 1.
When you went in on the stage, there was dead silence on the stage, you couldn't hear a thing. And then when the fire curtain went up, you heard 700 people outside in animated discussion. The tension then is actually unbearable.
The audience were up to the roof and they were cheering for you and knew all the words and knew all the dialogue. And when you came out, a Chrissy or a Mrs. Daniels or somebody else said you were wonderful, you were cat, you are much better, the other fellas are useless.
When you're going out with a 16-minute show of variety, you don't know whether the audience are going to like it or not. Are they going to laugh at the comedy? Will they see a seriousness of a serious scene? Will they understand what you were trying to do here, there, anywhere? Will it be colourful enough? Will the music be good enough? And all of these things. So your adrenaline on that opening night is incredible. That rush of adrenaline that you will never experience again.
That will live in my memory forever, and I'm sure everybody else's. The curtain down, the sound of the audience going quiet or getting excited at the start of the music and then quietly waiting for you while this music played. It was phenomenal. All your emotions, everything, you were tightened up, you were pent up, you were ready. And when the curtain opened, off you went. And that was it. It was terrific, really,
It was terrific. Michael Grant sums up in one short sentence exactly what the John Player Tops meant to so many Waterford people. In its heyday, the John Player Tops was an institution in the city where it was founded as a fundraiser for a local school. That was back in 1961. In the beginning.
In the beginning, we had absolutely nothing. A stage that is empty, just waiting for a show. And then quite suddenly we get some scenery, and all at once the lights begin to glow.
The opening number of Waterford Crystal's 1983 show could well have been written about the start of the John Player Tops back in the early 60s. In 1961, during his last term as Superior of St. Stephen's Street School, Reverend Brother Bernard set up a school renovation fund committee. The committee was set up to deal with the problem of finding enough money to maintain, restore and extend the school at Stephen Street. The committee had the approval of the then parish priest of St. Patrick's Church, who explained that St. Patrick's Parish, the smallest parish in the city, did not have the financial resources to contribute to the cost of maintaining the school. Brother Bernard was replaced as superior by Brother Augustine, recently arrived from Drogheda. Long-serving De La Salle committee member Tony Phelan recalls early 1962 when an idea was hatched.
It started in 1962, when St. Patrick's Church was unable to finance its contributions to St. Stephen's School, because each parish at the time paid towards each pupil they had, but St. Patrick's was quite a poor parish in those days. So the idea of a variety show was suggested by the then principal of St. Stephen's, Brother Augustine, to Canon Ryan, the parish priest of St. Patrick's. And the idea of competition of a 1 hour show between different groups was mooted by Brother Augustine, which he had done previously in Drogheda. So this idea came to Waterford. And the idea came about with 2 different groups appearing each night.
It's hard to imagine now that the original committee had been worried that there would be no uptake on the competition. In that first year, Tops attracted not 2 or 3, but no less than 12 teams. In the dark January nights of 1962, groups all over Waterford took a step into the unknown and began rehearsals for the new and as of yet unnamed competition. De La Salle Stephen Street provided a venue for a number of groups' rehearsals.
We all had a separate room in De La Salle and Stephen Street to rehearse. And you'd be doing, there's no business like show business. And someone would say, keep it down. They'll hear you next door. And don't do the sketches. Don't let them hear you doing the sketches because they might copy you. For God's sake, there's some laugh. Don't let them hear you. Only a door between us.
You'd be in there rehearsing, and next thing you'll be doing a number, and all of a sudden you'd hear some of the other shows down this hall doing it, and they'd be doing the same number, and you'd be saying to yourself, oh Jesus Christ, they're not doing it as good as us, or vice versa, they're better than us. But sure, You went ahead and done what you had to do.
And you'd have newspaper covering all the windows. Now, everybody could hear everybody else what they were practising. We were that innocent, like we thought we were in secret.
In the case of the Waterford Iron founders, rehearsal started in a far more humble setting.
The first rehearsal we had was up in Bernie Flanagan's house in Dial Street. And poor Mrs. Flanagan, I laughed when she saw everyone going up. We were all half mad.
And as Kathleen Madigan remembers, Waterford Glass, who were to become frontrunners in the competition, even set the pace when it came to rehearsal venues.
We all had to go up to De La Salle to halls up in Stephen Street School. The Glass were in the lap of luxury. They had a big canteen and be sandwiches and everything. I mean, they came out of work, everything was laid on for them.
But despite the diversity of the rehearsal venues, in the early days all of the groups had one thing in common.
Nobody knew what it was. It was something that was so new. And what the worst aspect of it was that if you weren't prepared for it, anything could happen and you could make a total idiot of yourself on the stage. And people, of course, Irish people being so self-conscious, we didn't want to do that.
We hadn't a clue about stage or singing or anything like that, about mics. Some of them was never even in the town hall before, as we used to call it.
Nobody knew what choreography was. They thought it was someplace out foreign. And then we found out it was dancing. So it became fashionable then to call it choreography.
And in those early days, even if all you had was a small gang of men, the show would still go on, as Denny and Paddy recall.
There was a few women working in the foundry at the time. They were getting involved. And Tommy O'Brien said, what, we go ahead. We'll enter a team anyway. 13 men.
You take the builder show now, there used to be 14 people in the builder show. 14 fellas and one girl. Greta Mackey was her name. And her favourite song was Me Old Scalera Hat.
Undaunted by these minor irritations, the 12 groups made it to the first ever competition. Tony Phelan recalls it was quite a long process.
It started in February, if I remember, in 62. It ran on until sometime in April. It was a long spell in those days, and they called the tops of the town.
The new competition was heralded in the Munster Express.
The elaborate plans which have been formulated for the staging of Waterford's first ever team talent competition in the local Theatre Royal are now well advanced by the Executive Committee of the De La Salle Building Fund, for whose meritorious object it has been organised. The prize money offered totals £100, and the winning team will also receive a handsome trophy, fabricated in Waterford glass.
With such a king's ransom on offer, the teams commenced battle.
And of course, the front runners from the word go, we'll have to say this, hit the ground running on this one, were the Foundry and Waterford Crystal, because both of those had an abundance of talent, an abundance of people who had performed at some stage either in pantomime, light operas or concerts, and so it was just a matter of somebody putting this all together, and that somebody became an indispensable part of Tops. That was the producer.
We'll return to the topic of producers later in the series. But for now, let's turn our attention to the first competitive night of Tops in Waterford. On February 1st, 1962, Good Bodies took on Hearns in the first ever Tops of the Town heat. The committee waited anxiously to see how the crowd would react.
Do you know where the Tower Hotel is now? Well, right on the corner there was an old hotel. The Tower have it taken up. They used to call it the Adelphi Hotel. And the committee and Mick Brown went over there for a drink, and they were waiting for the people to come out to see what was like, you know, the first Tops of the Town show. And the minute they all came out, they all headed over to the Adelphi Hotel, and they knew then that it was going to take off.
Denny remembers that the first Foundry show had a certain naive charm.
Tell you how naive we were. We didn't know what to do. Our opening was Bernie Flanagan playing Claire de Lune on the piano.
However, setting a trend that would continue to the very end, the Foundry took advice and promptly altered their show for the next round.
We got a man in called Sean Trainer. He said you'll have to have a big opening. We got a few of the lads in the St. Patrick's brass band and a few of the lads were in the Barracks brass band who could play instruments. We called them the Brass Hats.
The Brass Hats performed the Elvis Presley classic It's Now or Never, a little different than Bernie's Claire de Lune. One way or another, it didn't take an eager public long to recognise the true forte of the Foundry team was comedy, performed by a comedy team that would work together for the best part of the next 30 years.
Foundry with Denny and Bula and the other team that he used to have up there, Jimmy O'Brien and those fellas, well, they did sketch comedy that nobody could do. They were very sophisticated comedians.
They probably had the most talented comedy team ever, with the greatest of routines. They were wacky in their ways, and they had this wonderful attitude towards entertainment, that they would go out and they would make a mockery of everything that was out there, and it worked.
And make a mockery they did. On one occasion, they chose to make the Waterford Glass Show a target.
I can remember the time that Crystal had Hans Winkelmann, one of their bosses out there. They had him playing a grand piano on stage, and on the same night then the Foundry, wasn't it, brought out a piano held together with nails and things and banged around, and instead of a chandelier coming down they had a chamber pot.
Waterford Iron Founders ran out winners in the closely contested final with Waterford Glass and took home the grand prize of £50, a shield and replica. But did the De La Salle committee even dare contemplate just how successful that first year would be?
Never could have believed that it could be so successful, that people would nearly kill one another to get a ticket. It really gave an awful lot of pleasure to an awful lot of people.
The following year there was no shortage of teams willing to take part in Tops, with 10 teams lining up. Now that teams knew what they were up against, costumes and budgets became a hot topic of discussion. As May Sage, Kathleen Madigan and Patsy Sheridan recall.
They had no money. I mean, we used to go up after rehearsals and we used to go into Mr. Brown's house and we'd have a cup of tea and a slice of bread and we'd still be talking about the show. Anything we found at home we used as costumes. We did lovely costumes from second bag clothes.
Paddy Grant would decide that you're wearing blue or green or whatever your dress is, and it's up to you to go and get it. Started off with crepe paper and then it started going into bridesmaids' dresses. Cut up the bridesmaid dress, and you didn't even have a dressmaker. It was up to you. There were some people handy and they could make their own thing or sew their own thing. If you didn't, you had to go and find out who could sew for you. You done that yourself, you paid for it.
Everyone reused their costumes as well from the previous year. Where in some cases you may have had to hire them, but in most cases you did up your own costumes. At the end of every Tops, whatever number of costumes you had, you got them cleaned, you got them ironed, and they were kept for next year. So next year came, they were taken out, and depending on the show, the dancers' costumes were taken out, pieces were stripped off them, other pieces were put on, and you had new costumes again, but you never spent loads of money on costumes.
But as Patricia Welch remembers, for those lucky enough to be in a Waterford Glass Show, this didn't pose quite the same problem.
We hadn't to go out and buy loads of things for ourselves like other companies had to do as much. Another way others had to buy their own makeup and tights and all that. A lot of stuff was kind of given to us.
Despite this generosity, Noel Kane is quick to point out there wasn't necessarily an endless supply of money in the Waterford Glass coffers.
There wasn't an awful lot of money. There was a myth out there that we had big money, you know what I mean? And the money really wasn't there because it was always collected on the floor. All the workers gave in money towards it. And the management gave you some money, but it was very small compared to what they did probably maybe in the later years. But in the early years when Dermot Graham was producing, you had the likes of Dan O'Kelly and Dick Butler and all those guys were down and they were scraping money from every angle that they could. And I suppose 200 or 300 quid to put a show on for you.
Waterford Glass stormed to victory in 1963, beating Clover Meats in the final and also taking the prize for Best Compare for then personnel manager Tom Healy. Eddie and Noel Kane explained the importance of the compare in the fledgling Tops teams.
You had to have a compare. That was one of the biggest prizes you could get, the compares prizes. And there used to be tremendous battles on between the late Tom Healy and the late Tom Murphy, Tommy Fitzgerald, another one of them there, and Gus Curtin. They're the guys who linked the show together. The better they were at their link, the better the show appeared on stage.
Which was lovely in a sense, but it didn't let the show flow as much as it would have if that didn't happen, And I think there was nobody really prepared to take that on in the earlier days in the 60s because it was like everything, you followed on in what everyone else was doing.
Ernie Weiser would come out with a Foundry show and nowadays fellas are so self-conscious. Like if you have a rug on, as they say, if you've got a hairpiece on, the one thing you want to do is you don't want to show anyone that you have the hairpiece on and you want to get it the right colour and the texture and everything. Ernie would walk out, lift his hairpiece, like, evening all, and put the hairpiece back. And I mean, that was some start to a show. Like, where would you get that the type of fellas that would do that type of thing?
1964 saw new groups, new challenges and new characters enter the Tops. One such group was the Port and Docks. Tom Cullen and Paddy Madigan were there.
We wanted to give the impression that the dockers in Waterford could be as good as anybody else. And that was always the driving factor in the Port and Dock shows.
At that time you only had the old piano in the theatre and you had to get someone to play that at rehearsals and play that, and the only fellow we could get, he came down to Tom Cullen. I thought it was a joke, and Tom Cullen said, I'm after getting the best man in the town, he said. But anyway, the poor man was blind. Pat Power was the musical director at the time, and he used to play with Martin. And when we wanted to stop, Pat used to hit him on the shoulder. And when he wanted him to go, he'd hit him again. So you can imagine the fun and the black arm that went on.
The Port and Docks became one of the first shows to use a theme song regularly in their productions.
A man by the name of John O'Shea, had to do with Ballybricken Church. He was after writing a song, and it was called The Mighty River Shore. The song that was became synonymous with the Waterford Port and Docks that we named after Bafton Daft.
On the Waterford King, working the cargo ship, from near or far, fish guards and Sandy Park, they come to us on their lips. Australia has a river swan, the French speak out the same, South America can keep our Amazon.
And indeed this new craze passed on quickly to Waterford Glass, who adopted Another Opening, Another Show as their theme, and Clover Meats, who came up with their own song.
We done an opening chorus, 4-leaf clover. One is for bacon, the second for ham, the third is the sausage to suit every man. There's no need explaining the one remain, the puddings that we adore. Go on, Clover.
And not to be outdone, the combined builders adapted a popular song of the time. Noel Breen remembers it well.
Our opening chorus were always six lads dressed as open carols. The song went, happy days are here again, the builders bring you cheer again. Our girls in bride array again, happy days are here again.
And of course it didn't take long for the groups to start writing songs about each other. Paddy Madigan remembers one such example.
But what about the Glass? They're always doing fine. When they are rehearsing, they're on double time.
Despite this light-hearted banter, Tom Cullen clearly remembers that 1964 was a time when groups helped each other.
People in the Crystal group used to come and paint backdrops for the Port and Docks. Terry Murphy and Tommy Wall gave up nights painting backdrops for the Port and Docks. All these people gave up their time freely, no money involved, and were delighted. A lot of them couldn't even get a ticket to go and see the shows. The demand for the ticket that's another story totally, the way people clamoured for tickets for the Port and Docks on every show.
Indeed, Tom's memories of cooperation and friendship between groups is echoed right across the board, and everyone seems to remember a time when having fun was important and winning trophies was a distant afterthought.
I mean, it wasn't unusual for a team to go out in a local final and not make it to the quarter-final and give somebody else their set, or somebody else going down and saying, we loved your set for this, can we have it? People didn't always rebuild sets, Maybe Waterford Crystal did, but Waterford Crystal had carpenters and electricians and everything standing by to make scenery. But other people made do what other people had.
And at that time, there was no animosity between the groups. If you had something, and we say the Foundry were on next, and you had an old fireplace that they couldn't get for the sketch, everything was loaned out. What would happen when they got to the final, and that you had any costume that you had to make their show better, you lent them to them. And that's the kind of out-comradeship and our community spirit was there.
As the Tops competition began its third year, most groups were beginning to get comfortable with the surroundings of the Theatre Royal. But for the Port and Docks newcomers, it was a new and terrifying experience.
I was expecting to see something like when I used to go to the Jack Cruz show, the Jimmy O'D show, the lovely stage that was there and the curtains and everything looked so nice, But when I walked in the backstage and saw this big open bleak barrack looking thing, it frightened the daylights out of us. It really did.
All the lights, costumes, scenery, everything was gone. And there was a big black wall at the back of the theatre. And we went in, I'll always remember, and Tom Cullen looked around and he said, Penny, we're in the wrong place.
Paddy vividly remembers his first glimpse of a glass factory rehearsal earlier that same day.
Previous to that, who was on was the Waterford Crystal, and they had lights and scenery to bear the band, and they had the best of singers because everyone does at anyone working the glass factory. And as you know, Dermot Graham now, he could have been a professional producer. They were the ones you had to shoot at. They were like the Manchester United at that time of the tops of the town. So we went in. And we saved Tom Cullen and a fellow by the name of Billy Kelly, and we're sitting down watching the glass factory rehearsing. And Dermot Crane came he said, there's 3 people in here, shouldn't be in here. I wish you'd leave the theatre. So we had to get up and go over to Maureen Fannon's.
The Port and Docks were to go out in the first round that year, whilst unsurprisingly the Glass won again, beating the combined builders in the final and picking up the Best Male Performer award for Bertie Rogers. Adjudicator Jack Cruz lavished praise on the two shows, saying,
"It delights my heart to see the Theatre Royal packed from floor to ceiling by audiences who are so obviously enjoying themselves, watching real people perform, rather than sitting at home watching the Egypt box."
The end of the 1964 competition was to prove the first major milestone in Tops history, as Dublin Dairy's sponsorship of the competition came to an end. 1965 was to see the arrival of a new sponsor, who would change the face of Tops locally and nationally beyond all recognition.
The Tops, Programme 1.
1965. A new year, a new sponsor. Niall O'Flynn, National Coordinator of Tops, recounts a fateful approach from the Waterford Committee.
I was the PR manager in John Players, and Players and Wills were separate companies at the time. We got an approach from a man called Arthur Doyle here in Waterford about this competition they were running down here. Would we like to sponsor it? So I came down to meet him, and I already had a little understanding of what was happening, because we had a variety group in Players in the factory in Glasnevin, which had entered a competition in Drogheda called the Leinster Top Factories competition. This was really akin to the Tops, and this created such excitement amongst the staff and in the factory that we knew this was something worthwhile. So when I came down here and saw the impact that it's had here, I went back to the company and suggested we get involved. And that's how we got involved. So Waterford was the first place that Players actually sponsored Tops.
Niall O'Flynn is remembered fondly to this day as Mr. Tops.
I had many dealings with Niall O'Flynn because I was Secretary of the Theatre Royal, and Niall O'Flynn had that peaceful air about him, that problems were there to be solved. He'd see what he could do. He humoured people, and even when people were giving out, they gave out. I'm going to tell Niall O'Flynn that adjudicator don't like us, and he'd listen and say, yes, and everything else. And you came away kind of feeling that he had listened and he was going to do something about it.
I suppose he was another Bertie Hearn. He was able to manage every group. We all had our problems, and we all went and we all rang up Niall, and we had this, we had that, and he dealt with all the groups, not in Waterford now, but all over Ireland. You felt with Niall that he was just looking after you.
He was being called on for everything, and being blamed for everything, or being demanded to adjudicate on everything.
Niall O'Flynn always tried to be straight with you without ever being insulting, and I think that's a great talent in any person, when you're looking for something that you can't have and he's able to refuse you and remain your friend.
Niall, however, had a simple philosophy.
Well, I always had a very basic attitude. I like to treat people the way I would like to be treated myself. I would try and do what was right by them as best I could. Now there was flack on many occasions, and I often got dogged abuse about results and things, but it wasn't enduring. And some of the people who were most vocal would end up as your best pals.
As 1965 dawned, the competition, now known as the John Player Tops, began to come into its own. The casts of shows began to take on a new shape, of the animal kind. Paddy and Denny take up the story.
We had a fellow, Ikey Halligan was his name, and Ikey got the idea about being a magician, you see. So he got a load of the pigeons, and he brought them down to the Theatre Royal, and he kept the homer, and he'd leave off all the pigeons, and he'd take out the homer, and the minute the rest of the pigeons saw the homer, they'd all fly back. We must have done it about 10 times. So the next thing, we went down to the theatre that night, and with the crowds and all that, he left off all the pigeons, and they all went up on the chandeliers. And the next thing, he took out the homer, and the pigeons wouldn't come down because everyone was laughing in the night, and they were all shitting down on the people in the stores.
We had rehearsals in the pattern shop because we had a horse in it. Everyone was scared that the horse might jump out into the audience, and so we had rehearsal for the horse. Michael O'Brien brought up 2 big speakers, and we put on either side of the horse. We see would the horse move. Here were these 2 speakers blowing his ears. He just nodded his head, and he was okay.
As Denny remembers, having a horse belonging to the travellers in a show had its own unique risks.
A few mornings after, I was going up to the foundry, and I was passing the encampment where the the Travellers were. And no sign of the Travellers. The horse, everything was gone. And we were in the semi-final that Friday night. I went into work. I said, the Travellers are gone. So Bulla said, what do you expect out of the Travellers?
Thankfully, the Travellers had only travelled as far as Jones's Wood in South Kilkenny.
I said, get the horse for the semi-final. We got Bulla and Bobby Shanahan. They wanted a few hours of work. So they went to Jones's Wood and they found the Travellers. They done a deal with them. £2 in, and Bulla and Shan brought the horse into town. All down the quay, and everyone, hey, that's a horse from the Foundry show.
And as Paddy Madigan recalls, a horse wasn't the only thing the Travellers were kind enough to lend the Foundry.
Another night, I remember I was down there and the Foundry were on, and they had an ass. Paddy Bulla Power was out there asking the itinerants up the rock when they were going to walk that morning out to the Foundry. Would he bring down the ass? They had the ass in the scene. They used to actually bring the ass out. That'll tell you what went on. The ass across the stage, and when they came to the time to get the ass out on the stage, the ass wouldn't go out on the stage. And what they done? They got a lighter and they turned on the lighter and put it under the ass's balls, and he kicked. He kicked. He went across the stage.
An article in the Irish Times on Tuesday, March 9th, 1965 reported a recent show in Waterford where a group of girls appeared on the stage in almost nakedness. Patricia Welch picks up the story.
The costumes were actually, what they were now was a bra, more or less like a woman's bikini top. Just went straight across, they weren't even shaped. And over that was a satin bra again, stitched on, right? Down below we wore at the end of a man's bathing togs, which was pretty big, black bathing togs, right? And over that then we wore the same colour satin, a big satin scarf all down one leg. It went right down to our ankles from our waist, down one side. The same colour as whatever top you had on you. And we had black fishnet tights and shoes. And all was really shown was a midriff, but seemingly it was the first time that a midriff was ever seen in the theatre aisle, in any show. You know, so when we done a scene called The Tropical Heatwave, and they had big palm trees, and there were 6 of us. May was one of the 6. There was Eileen O'Regan, Kathleen Green, Nolene Toomey. So we all came out from behind the palm trees and we did our dance. Now the audience didn't mind. No one in the audience seemed to have minded. But the chairman of the Tops of the Town, who was a De La Salle brother, he was in the audience, and of course he was flabbergasted at this. And he can tell you Dermot was sent a letter or whatever, was told it wasn't acceptable, that, you know, our costumes were too skimpy.
Teresa Graham remembers that even the local clergy got involved in the proceedings, and Dermot was the topic of a Sunday morning sermon.
But somebody went to the Dominicans and complained. So on Sunday morning he was read off the altar, which was a big thing at that time. I mean, you know, they could condemn you to everlasting fire for whatever.
Teresa recalls that Dermot was approached by the committee to alter the scene.
He was asked by the committee to take it off, and he said no. He said either we let it in or I pull the show. That was his ultimatum. Always wicked stubborn. You know, if he thought something was right, he would fight to the very last for it.
So obviously it was taken up then by the papers, because Frank Hall used to do a programme after the news on RTE, and he used to read all the headlines on the papers around the country, and it came out on the News Star in Waterford, Some Like It Hot.
That year, Waterford Glass didn't reach the final. We'll never know if their failure to do so had anything to do with the skimpy and so-called immoral costumes the girls wore, although in the more modest climate of the 1960s, it could well have been the case. Patricia still thinks the show could have won that year.
The show was good enough and to go on, so therefore it was an awful way to put somebody out just because of a skimpy costume.
There was another storm in 1965, and this one was not of the tropical kind. As Paddy recalls, adjudicator Danny Cummins made a controversial decision at the semi-final stages.
Danny Cummins came down to adjudicate the thing, and he put 3 of us into the final, and there was pandemonium on the Mall that night. They put the builders into the final, and we had to play off at the Waterford Iron Foundries. And what happened is we bet the Foundry in the finals, in the playoff. It was a Saturday night, and they had to issue extra tickets for the thing, and there was more. They overturned the box. Poor Paddy Doyle was in the box, and they overturned the box in the Theatre Royal. The man was nearly killed getting tickets. So from then we had to have the extra night, and we had the final then between us and the Builders, and we went on to win it.
So, in controversial circumstances, the Portland Docks claimed their only local title. 1965 certainly had been an eventful year. Near nudity, an erratic semi-final adjudication, and gang warfare over tickets in the Theatre Royal. Ah yes, tickets. That old chestnut was to crop up time after time.
I'll tell you what, you'd sold your grandmother for a ticket for the Tops. And probably your grandfather, you could have got 2 tickets.
There was people nearly killed queuing outside the gas company for them. Talk about U2 and Westlife. There was a queue about 6 miles long by down to the waterside.
There's this Red man, I'd better heaven to him, he's dead now. He came up and he nearly cried in my face one day. We were going away to Dublin. He spun me a lovely story anyway, so I gave him 2 tickets. Got up to go to work the next day, and I opened the door, and on the handle of the door was a load of blaze. Jeez, I said, where are these blaze coming from, you know? So I met him after, did you get them blaze this morning? I got blaze for about, until we actually reached the final. And one morning, in the blaze, there was stuff for Joe and makeup and stuff like that for Joe. So I had to give him the tickets for the final every time he come. And I remember the free deals on it, and you get the meal off of Claire Wilson. That he was in at that as well. I remember. As soon as the Tops of Town was over, I got nothing.
Before, say, the final, there'd be so many tickets allocated, and they'd be drawn out of a hat. And I remember one year Frankie King was in the last show, and he was playing the trumpet, and his dog was singing, you know, on the stage. And Frankie's dog was put into the hat, and he got 2 stall tickets, and somebody else didn't. They got only balcony tickets, and there was absolute war, you know. My wife got no tickets, and Frankie King's dog got 2 stall tickets.
I always remember my mother's birthday was coming up, and the 2nd of June was my mother's birthday. God be good to her, and I was wondering what I'd get her for her birthday. And I got her 2 tickets for the Tops of the Town, and she nearly got down on her knees to me, thanking me. You know, 2 tickets for the final of the Tops of the Town. It was better than £100 notes worth. Herself and her friend went off to the Tops of the Town that night and possibly got their bag of chips on the way home and from coming up Barry Street.
And May remembers one ticket story in particular, involving the inimitable Paddy Madigan.
We were down one night at a final, and we were outside. It is the only time ever that I didn't get a ticket for a Tops of the Town show. I was outside, heartbroken. You see, I had little to worry about, but I was heartbroken. So Paddy Madigan came along and said, no, he said, there's 2 tickets. Oh God, I said, up we goes, and we up into the balcony. Paddy poured the bed of heaven to us, shows us to our seats. The seats are taken. And I said to the lady, excuse me, you're sitting in my seat. No, she said, I'm not, these are mine. So Paddy Power said, well, you sit down on the steps till interval. Grand, we sat down on the steps. Interval came, the lights went on, and what was Paddy Madigan after doing? Giving us the tickets belonged to the night before. And I insisted to the woman that she was sitting in my seat. So good enough out of Paddy Power, he said, right, you can stay there, he said, for the next show. Maybe he shouldn't have done it, I don't know, but he left to sit there for the final.
I was looking down on the balcony all night, and the 2 of them were sitting on the steps. So they saw the 2 shows anyway, and they came out, and they said, you're some bastard, Paddy Madigan. Why, they were for the night before them tickets.
The combined builders came runners-up to the Portland Docks in 1965, but in 1966 they went one better, beating the National Board and Paper Mills in the final. Most remember the combined builders shows with fondness. Noel Breen was an ever-present cast member in the builders shows.
At the time, the show was supposed to go on for 1 hour and 5 minutes, but our show went on for 1 hour and 25 minutes. Due to inexperience on our part, we had drink on the stage, and I think everybody stayed on the stage. The longer it stayed on, the more drink you got. As the adjudicator said after he summed up, he said the drink had gone up 4 pence at that time, and he said that the price of drink made no difference to the builders tonight. He said there's so much drink on the stage. It was kind of non-rehearsed to a certain extent, that there was about 24 people on the stage, and there's odd chairs all sitting down on the stage, and anybody wanted to go up and sing a song, they went up and sang a song. And there was one scene there where we call him Johnny, went up and he sang a song and done a bit of a dance. He was bending down a bit, and next thing his pants ripped. Well, I don't know where we had underpants at that time, but things would be seen anyway, as the fella said. And he went backwards and to sit on the chair, and he fell off the chair. Fella pulled the chair from under him, and he got up, and next thing he made a go for him. And of course, everybody thought it in the act.
Not only did the Builders take the coveted trophy in 1966, but they managed to capture the Best Compares prize for Tom Murphy. Rehearsals in the 1960s were far from the disciplined regime that followed in later years. For everyone involved, they were fun, a social outlet in a city coming out of hard times.
We never took it serious like we did later on for doing so many bad things.
The only pressure was on us was to keep our mouths shut of what we were doing. That's the only pressure. Make sure you didn't tell the others what you were doing, the secrecy, and that was absolutely brilliant.
The big thing, if you want to say for the Tops of the Town, is what it did for the young people of Waterford at that time. There were hundreds of people who were involved in all these shows, and for 3 months, after Christmas, on Tops of the Town were involved in groups in the De La Salle. The friendships that were there, everybody was tied into the Tops, and everybody hadn't time for anything else.
I mean, we were coming out of bad times in the country, and we were all starting to get a few bob, and we were all starting to get a bit of freedom into ourselves. And I suppose that made times a bit better because we were able to go home and have a few pints after it, and we were able to do this and do that.
1967 saw a resurgence of the Waterford Iron Founders, taking not only first place but also Best Producer for Nancy Troy and Joe Daniels, Best Compare for Ernie Miser, and the Adjudicator's Special Award for Denny Corcoran. Eddie remembers working with Nancy Troy.
Nancy would get totally involved in it. She got so involved in the show on it, she walked out in the middle of the thing to correct something, and they said the show on her full way. But Nancy was doing a show, and we're doing a big scene from Oklahoma. You're going fine. Then out in the middle, okay, Oklahoma. There was panic. Who's singing Oklahoma, says Nancy. So she had an idea to your man, and she said to him, say Oklahoma. Oklahoma. Say it as fast as you can now. Oklahoma, Oklahoma, Oklahoma. Well, she said, it couldn't be you. Then he said, sing it. Oh, Lacoma, where the sun came. He was no one ever after his Oklahoma.
8 teams took part in 1968. Waterford Glass were back after a 2-year absence, but could go no further than the semi-finals, despite Dermot Graham being at the helm for his 5th production. Teresa Graham is able to pinpoint exactly why Waterford Glass sometimes fell at the final hurdle.
I think one of the things that why they didn't win more was the innovations that it took. When Dermot would do something new, it took a while for it to sort of be accepted. You know, that he wouldn't stay to the same tried and tested formula, or that he was always testing the boundaries and pushing out. He was never content to repeat the same thing. He would always be seeing how far he could go. He would do it one year, then everybody would accept it. It would become accepted the next year or the year after. Whereas the year he would do it, everybody would say, oh God, you know.
And it is a truism that in Waterford, the Glass and Dermot were the yardsticks by which every other show was to be judged.
The thing was that he never copied directly. Anything he did was what he would absorb, whatever he saw, and then he would reproduce it in his own way. And that was how he worked. But I then think that he transformed what was going on in the Tops of the Town. And I think it is fair to say that the standard to beat was always Dermot Graham, or Dermot Graham as it's called. I think I changed his name to Graham.
The Portland Ducks provided the opposition in the final, but once again it was Waterford Iron Founders who swept the boards, winning not only first prize, but also Best Compare yet again for Ernie Miser, Best Producer for Nancy Troy, and Best Female for Julie Madden. That year, as Denny remembers, the Foundry had a special prop in one of their scenes.
We had a wooden cooker. It looked like a real Stanley cooker. I had an idea. We get Chuck's bones and bring him over where Gus Curran used to live in Malane. And Mrs. Curran had put the bones, Chuck's and everything on. And when the sketch you want, we'd have the bones and the most marvellous smell all over the town hall. Everyone said the Foundry have a show in the Tops and they have a cooker on the stage that's really cooking.
As 1968 drew to a close, something was about to change on a national scale. John Player had already become involved in sponsoring similar competitions in centres around the country.
A few competitions were already going, like there's one in Wexford, and we got involved in sponsoring that. There had been one in Limerick many years prior to that, I think, and it had sort of collapsed, and we went to Limerick and sort of got it revitalised and introduced us into Cork. And the big one, of course, was Dublin. At its peak, there were 18 centres around the country.
With so many groups now performing in their own tops competitions around the country, a national final was a natural progression.
A colleague of mine, a man called Austin Mullen, he sort of introduced me to the one in Drogheda, and there was a priest there who ran the one in Drogheda, a man called Father Michael Dorman. He was the parish priest, and they used to run it up there, and we got Drogheda obviously into the thing. And when we had about 9 centres for the Dorman, said to me, now maybe, there should be a national dimension to this. So that sowed the seed, and we started a national final, which at that time wasn't televised, but the first national final was in the Gaiety in 1969.
Considering its roots, the first national final, fittingly enough, featured a Waterford group, Heart's Delight. It was hailed as a brilliant show, featuring scenes from Oliver as a centrepiece. Joe Barrett recalls the show.
Tops of the town came around, and we went in and we got through the first round. We got into the second round. The next thing we were announced in the semi-final, and we got to the final, and we were up against the Paper Mills, which had a fantastic show the same year. I always remember the final night we were on second. At that time, when the show was over, you had to get all your props out, and they were about 20 minutes bringing out the props. And I remember some fella coming down Flaggy Lane the same night, and he wanted to know was it Ben Hur was on in the theatre. I didn't ever think that I would be involved with the Tops of the Town show that would win in Waterford. And I still say the national final was only secondary for me.
But win they did, and on to the national final they went. It was a new and exciting experience for everyone associated with the Tops. Joe remembers how he found out Heart's Delight had made the final.
We had about 2, maybe 3 weeks to wait then to know whether we get into the national final. And I always remember sitting down here, actually in this where we are now, sitting down one evening. Next thing, there was a big loud bang at the door, and I went out, and there was about 6 or 7 of the boys from the Heart's Delight show outside, and they were singing and shouting. We were through to the national final in the Gaiety in Dublin. On the Sunday, we were in the national final in the Gaiety. We went up by train. There was no buses or anything. We all travelled up by train. We got buses into the centre of Dublin, and we had our lunch in the hotel down Damien Street, the North Star. And who was sitting down at the table alongside us all day, we were amazed to see him, was Noel Purcell, the film star. And Noel Julie came over and asked us what we were doing, and he was delighted and wished us well, and we all had to walk up to the Gaiety then.
The adjudicator for that first national final was none other than Maureen Potter.
I always remember Maureen Potter. She got up and she says, now the results of the shows is this, and she announced us as first 79 points. We had thought we were after winning it, 79, and she said Harry Allen grew from Drogheda 80 points. There was a silence among all our crowd. You could, but sure, these things happen.
In 8 short years, the John Player Tops had come from humble beginnings as a fundraiser for a local school to a national competition with 8 centres and a national final in Ireland's most prestigious theatre. The decade that would follow would be recognised by all as the golden age of Tops in Waterford, making legends out of ordinary people who trod the stage of the theatre by night and got up to work the next morning. It's important not to lose sight of what the Tops meant to people in the 1960s and beyond. Tom and Michael put it all in perspective for us.
This is good for the young people, this is good for the school, this is good for Waterford. Everybody that was involved, that was the attitude that drove it, and that was the attitude that made such a success. Nobody looked for anything personal out of Tops of the Town because there was nothing personal to be gained.
We used to look at all these shows, and my father worked in the foundry, and he'd be talking about Denny and Boola and all those people, Bernie Flanagan's, and so we used to hear the names, and then we got interested in the shows and we'd go to see them, or we'd hear people talking about them. But the big names were the Dennys, the Boolas, the Anne McGraths, the Bertie Rogers, obviously, and the Dermot Grahams.
The friendships that were created at that time are still alive today. I mean, I meet women now, and I don't tell me, Tom, you don't recognise me. I was in the bloody show with you. You know,
You've been listening to The Tops, Programme 1. Next week.
I can remember fantastic chandeliers on the stage and grand pianos, and it was on a different level, to be honest about it, to what we had.
The night of Superstar in the Gaiety in Dublin, we got 100 marks all the way.
One of the finest groups that we ever had in ACs, of course, was the Ballahassie. We had them back in the 70s, and then we had them as well right through. They were fantastic.
Dermot was a perfectionist, probably one of the most talented guys that came through the Tops. He was a wonderful musician. He had a great ear for music. He had a wonderful eye.
Denny, I think, in my view, was probably the most all-round talent I've ever seen in Tops, because he could do everything.